My name is Jaime Battiste. I'm the Treaty Education Lead for Nova Scotia. I work out of the Mi'kmaq Kina'matnewey office in Member 2. One of the first things that happened when the Europeans arrived is they arrived around southern Nova Scotia near what's called Port Royal. And during the first winter, we were told that many of the first French explorers, as they call them, died off within the first winter. After that, Grand Chief Member 2, the next group of explorers that came, he took them under his wing. He showed them how to survive. He showed them what medicines were used, how to survive the harsh winters, what food, how to trap. Basically showed them how to survive in the New World, as they would know it. But to the Mi'kmaq, it was just how to survive in Mi'kma'ki. Well, we were told that there was a respect created between the Mi'kmaq and the French. They traded, they shared stories, there was intermarriage, they talked about various things, they talked about religion, they talked about politics, and one of the things that most people you look at when you talk about the French, the Catholic during that time, most of the power wouldn't have invested in the French king. Rather, it would have been in the Pope itself and in the Vatican. So many of the laws that were created, many of the policies were created that were internationally, came from the Vatican at that point, which was the power for the Roman Catholic states in Europe. Well, as part of what is known as the Concordat, in 1610, Grand Chief Member 2 was baptized along with many of his family and members from that region. And we're told that the reason is that not only did it create a political alliance with the Vatican and the Pope, but also that they found a lot of similarities within the two belief systems, the belief system of the Mi'kmaq and the belief system of the Roman Catholic Church. However, one of the things that was clear is that when the Grand Chief Member 2 took on this baptism, he wasn't abandoning his faith or abandoning any of the teachings that he had. Rather, it was part of what would be considered, and creating alliance and creating good relations with the French, as opposed to abandoning his faith. Well, because the Mi'kmaq were, this is what the Supreme Court of Canada said in the Marshall decision, is that the Mi'kmaq were a considerable fighting force. And basically they had the power to tip the balance between the British and the French of who won during that period of when they had the King's George War in I believe it started in 1744. But there was always conflict between the French and the British over the New World, and the Mi'kmaq, who were basically controlled the eastern seaboard, were a very powerful ally to have at the time. And so it was important that whoever wanted to secure the New World, they had to create alliances with the Mi'kmaq. Now the Mi'kmaq, like I said, were a considerable fighting force. In 1 year alone, they took 22 British ships. So this is a fighting force, a raiding force, an ability that the Mi'kmaq had. And so in order to establish themselves a stronghold, the European powers would have known they had to establish peace with the Mi'kmaq. And so where the Mi'kmaq had secured peace with the French for many years, it was the British that really wanted to create alliances with the Mi'kmaq. Gabriel Sylliboy was our Grand Chief of the Mi'kmaq Nation, and he had been told for generations that he had a treaty. And it was important for him at that point to make a stand. And he was the first Indigenous person to stand in front of a trial and say, we have these treaty rights. Now, of course, in 1929 or 1928, as when the judgment came down, there wasn't a lot of, well, I'll use the words of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1985 when they said the language that was used in the Sylliboy case represented the prejudices and bias of another era, and that language is no longer acceptable, because they felt that, oh, well, the Mi'kmaq could never have been strong enough or smart enough to create alliances with the British Crown. And it was only in 1985, more than 60, 70 years later, that they actually did the research on the treaties and found, yes, the Mi'kmaq were telling the truth all this time. But Gabriel Sylliboy was the first one of our people to actually attempt to stand in front of a court and said we have these rights. He was a pioneer and is recognized for that. Well, the Declaration de Guerre, the Declaration of War, as it is known, one of the things you have to realize is that a large part of the reason that Europeans came across to the New World is for any other reason the king would want is for money, for wealth, to create trade, to create economies. And so, there was always talk about expansion and creating, ports, but the biggest thing was they wanted to accumulate wealth. Any king, a European king, it seemed to be driven by the accumulating wealth. So as part of that, they, every trading charter that they sent across to the New World, they instructed them to create trade with the Mi'kmaq. However, they sent a person by the name of Edward Cornwallis, as he would be the governor of Nova Scotia. And as opposed to going down to southern Nova Scotia and creating trade and peace with the Mi'kmaq, he landed in Halifax or Chibuktu, or the Mi'kmaq would have called it Jibuktuk. And the Mi'kmaq were alarmed by that. And the Mi'kmaq said, well, you have treaties with us in the southern parts of Nova Scotia, and you're allowed to reside in that area. However, when he showed up in Jibuktuk area, that alarmed the Mi'kmaq. And the Mi'kmaq basically sent him a letter saying, what are you doing here? You're taking up too much land. You're infringing on territory that isn't yours. And basically saying that even, I think one of the things it says, an earthworm knows enough to defend himself if it's attacked. And so it was more of a question about the Mi'kmaq sending a letter of what are your intentions here, but General Cornwallis took it as a declaration of war and declared war on the Mi'kmaq. And in 1749, not only declared war on the Mi'kmaq, but also within a few years put an extirpation policy that said that they would put a bounty on every Mi'kmaq man, woman, and child if you produced a Mi'kmaq scalp. Now, their extirpation policy didn't really work too much on the Mi'kmaq, because the Mi'kmaq were skilled. This is with their territory. They had a huge advantage. They knew where the food was, and so basically Cornwallis was limited to the fort he created. When his people came out of the fort to try to look for food, the Mi'kmaq would attack them, and so it was basically the Mi'kmaq who just kept them contained into their forts, and so that the Europeans couldn't do much. So after a number of years of this extirpation policy and Governor Cornwallis trying to rid the world of the Mi'kmaq, the Lords of Trade in British said, he's not doing anything to create wealth for us, and they replaced him with a person by the name of Thomas Hobson. And when Governor Hobson came in, he decided that he wanted to create peace with the Mi'kmaq, and that was what we know now as the 1752 Treaty, which was the basis of all of the treaties that said, what we're really trying to do is bury the hatchet, create alliance, create peace, create trade, and that's what the Mi'kmaq treaties were about. They weren't about ceding of land, they weren't about ceding of resources, they were about creating alliances, creating trade, creating peace and friendship, and that's how you should understand the Mi'kmaq treaties and that period of 1752. Well, I think that the French had an understanding with the Mi'kmaq because they had lived with the Mi'kmaq for decades, if not generations, not centuries, and there was intermarriage. They became part of their family, but and the Mi'kmaq accepted them, and there was that inclusion, or instead of exclusion, with Mi'kmaq and the French and things like that. And so I think that one of the things that I've never seen is a French treaty with the Mi'kmaq, because they developed a relationship and a respectful relationship. But when after a number of years of French claiming, well, this is French territory. That kind of bothered the Mi'kmaq, and the Mi'kmaq began to become wary of the French king and his intentions. So when the French and British started fighting in the New World, the Mi'kmaq said, you know what, we're not going to take sides in this. We're going to stay in the middle, and whoever ends up winning this we'll deal with. But the Mi'kmaq realized real quickly that neither the French or the British were to be wholeheartedly trusted, so they stayed out of their war.